Well, there's no denying that Canada has some of the best doctors in the world, and nurses for that matter, and for the most part, they are highly professional. However, mistakes do happen. Medical errors contribute to between 23,000 and 60,000 deaths in Canada annually and cause pain and suffering to many more individuals. Joining us this evening to talk about this is Lindsay Charles, an esteemed personal injury lawyer with McLeish, Orlando. Welcome back to the show, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me.
That is quite a stat, 23 to 60,000 deaths in Canada. What do you need to prove to have a successful medical malpractice case?
Sure. So there's two things that you have to look at when you're determining whether or not you want to start a lawsuit for a medical malpractice lawsuit. So first is the standard of care. So what you first have to show is that the treatment that you were provided falls below the level to which a reasonable doctor that is the same kind of training or specialty would have provided to you.
So how would you go about doing that?
So usually you'd have to hire an expert to kind of review all the clinical notes and records that you've been provided with after your whatever procedure happened that went wrong, and the expert would come back and kind of let you know if that standard was met or not.
Okay, and is that causation?
So that's the first part. So after you kind of look at that, you also have to prove causation. So what causation is you have to show that first you did suffer harm as a result of this negligence. You also have to show that the harm that was caused to you wouldn't have happened but for that negligence. So that's usually a critical thing to look at for a lot of people that have suffered from medical malpractice, mainly because sometimes it might have already happened anyway, but for even if the negligence didn't happen. So you see that a lot with delayed diagnosis of cancer cases and things like that. So that's why these cases are a bit onerous.
So, okay, I can understand that if it happened to me, but what happens if death happened to me? Then how does my family proceed?
Sure. So again, you have to keep those two things in mind, the standard of care and causation. You have to see if, but for the negligence, you wouldn't have died. So that's kind of your second step, the causation test. But of course, your family members can always start a lawsuit for the losses they've suffered as a result of your death.
So what are some of the things or damages that you can actually make a claim for if you meet the standard of care and show causation?
Perfect. So there's two types of damages. There's non-pecuniary damages and pecuniary damages.
Okay, hang on. Break that down. What does that mean?
Perfect. So, for instance, if you've lost income as a result of this negligence, if you're going to have a future loss of earning capacity, say you were a child and you're not working now, but maybe in the future your work life's going to be different. If you're going to need future care, so if a personal support worker needs to come in and help you, or you need physiotherapy or an occupational therapist, those kinds of things, you can get compensation for that. And of course, there's your loss of household and handyman capacity. So, help around the house, help outside the house, shoveling the snow, cutting the grass, those kinds of things. And then the other side of it is just your pain and suffering. Maybe you're not able to go for the runs that you used to love doing, or go water skiing with your kids, or hanging out with friends as much. There's compensation for that as well.
Okay, so let's go through some of the examples of what would be considered a medical malpractice case. I mean, we start with a misdiagnosis.
Sure. Yeah. So you might go into your doctor, you're complaining of certain symptoms, it's kind of dismissed, and then symptoms persist and a diagnosis is made later. So that's kind of a delayed diagnosis, or you can consider sometimes a misdiagnosis where they think it's one thing, but it turns out to be another thing that might be more serious. That's one type of thing. There's sometimes things go wrong with surgical procedures. Sometimes things are kind of left in you or something like that when you're having surgery. Or, there's obviously all the cases we very clear, whoops, I cut off the wrong finger, or whoops, I cut off the wrong foot. Those are very clear cut, obviously. There's sometimes a lot of issues with pregnancy and childbirth and child delivery, but I would say a lot of the cases that we see coming through our office have to deal with wrong prescriptions, delayed diagnosis of certain illnesses.
So what about mistakes with ongoing treatment, like if the wrong drugs are prescribed or something like that?
Yeah, so we do see that a lot too. That's what I would consider kind of a prescription error, or sometimes the dosages are even off, which can affect things too. But you have to bear in mind that you still need to have suffered harm as a result of the negligence. You can't forget the standard of care and the causation. So those are things you do need to keep in mind.
Okay, so what are alternatives to starting a lawsuit?
Sure. So a lot of the time, if you might not necessarily be able to meet the standard of care, prove causation, or maybe it's just too traumatic to go through a lawsuit, you can make a complaint about the physician involved to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. A lot of the times we find with people that's kind of it makes them feel better knowing that, hey, this happened to me, but I don't want this to happen to someone else. So a complaint is made and they kind of feel better about that, and it's dealt with the physician.
Does a medical malpractice suit, does it cover if there's something done to you, a sexual assault by a doctor? Does that, or is that a separate thing?
That would be a separate type of lawsuit. It wouldn't be considered medical malpractice. Obviously, you'd still be kind of suing the doctor, but that wouldn't be the same kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the loss of income and earning capacity, cost of care, cost of housekeeping, plus pain and suffering. I mean, these could be considerable lawsuits.
Yeah, those are all components of a lawsuit. So these are different claims that you would make in what's called a statement of claim if you decide to sue. And you would make a claim for loss of income and earning capacity. You'd make a claim for future costs of care, a claim for loss of household and handyman capacity, and a claim for what we call general damages, which is kind of like your pain and suffering and loss of enjoyment of life.
But I don't think people really realize how expensive cost of care is.
Yeah, that's a major thing that once you kind of get into the field, whether you're a treating practitioner or you're a lawyer working this field, it kind of opens your eyes as to how much someone would need if they need 24-hour care, or how much they would need if they need an occupational therapist or a rehab support worker coming in to help them out. So it is important that if you think something's gone wrong, you should kind of seek some help to see if you should be starting a claim or not.
All right. So then somebody comes to you and they say something went wrong. Do you hire the investigator? Do you conduct the investigation for them?
Yeah, usually what we would do is we'd work with the family to either, first of all, sometimes you can tell just from looking at the facts, but most of the times we would have to hire an expert to determine whether or not we think that there's a claim that's worth pursuing. Sometimes there's a small retainer associated with that at the beginning. Other times there's not. It just depends on the circumstances of the case and of the family. So it kind of varies.
Now, this is putting you on the spot. How successful are these suits? Because I would think that large organizations like hospitals have pretty good legal teams behind them.
They absolutely do. They work through what's called the CMPA, and they hire very good counsel to protect the doctors, which we hope would happen if I was on the flip side too. It depends. Like if you do your due diligence, you want to minimize risk, which is why you usually try to get an expert to comment before you start issuing a claim. It really depends on the case, and it really depends on factors that come up throughout the case. So that's kind of a wishy-washy answer for you, but at least at the beginning you're kind of doing your due diligence in most cases, or that's our kind of practice before you start the lawsuit.
So is there a statute of limitations? If a couple of years later you go, what's caused this problem is there was medical malpractice back when I had that.
Yeah, there's statute of limitations. They vary depending on people's ages too, and
people's ages? Why?
Yeah, so if you're a child, you don't have to start a lawsuit before you turn the age of majority. And then there's also different principles depending, again, on the case about discoverability. But the general limitation period is a 2-year limitation period. And then there are some nuances to that are more difficult to kind of argue in this kind of short period of time here. But there are some times, I'm not going to say a lot of the times, a way around that, but it's usually the 2 years from the date of the loss.
All right. So, Lindsay, tell people where they can reach you if they need the services of a personal injury lawyer.
Sure. So I work for McLeish Orlando, and my email's on the website, but it's just lcharles@mcleishorlando.com.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Great information as usual.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is What She Said. Stay with us.